There is a silence that heals, and then there is a silence that tests you. Not every distance is detachment. Not every withdrawal is surrender. Sometimes when a narcissistic woman pulls away, she is not moving on. She is standing still, watching, waiting to see if you will break first, waiting to see if you will doubt yourself, waiting to see if you will return, not as an equal, but as someone smaller than before. This is not about love. This is about power, validation, and control. And today we will uncover 5 signs that reveal when her silence is not peace, but a psychological invitation for you to reach out. She goes silent, but she stays visible. And this is where most people misunderstand what is happening. Silence, in its healthy form, is a withdrawal meant for reflection, for healing, for separation. But this silence is different. It is not absence, it is presence without engagement. A psychological posture where the body retreats, but the gaze remains fixed. When a narcissistic woman goes silent, she rarely vanishes completely. She stops initiating contact, stops responding warmly, stops offering emotional availability. Yet she continues to exist on the edges of your awareness. She watches your stories. She appears in your notifications just long enough to remind you she is still there. A like appears and disappears. A post is viewed within minutes. Sometimes there is a subtle reaction, sometimes none at all. This is not accidental. It is a way of saying, I am gone, but not unreachable. At a deeper psychological level, this behavior reveals an inner conflict. She wants distance, but she cannot tolerate insignificance. To disappear entirely would mean risking the terrifying possibility that she no longer matters to you. And so she chooses the middle ground. Silence that provokes curiosity, distance that invites pursuit. Human beings are deeply disturbed by ambiguity. The mind searches for patterns, for meaning, for resolution. When communication stops but visibility remains, the psyche fills the gap with questions. Did I do something wrong? Is she angry? Is she hurting? Is she waiting for me? These unanswered questions slowly pull attention inward, consuming emotional energy. This is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is more instinctive than that. It is a survival strategy built around validation. Consider how often this dynamic plays out in real life. A man notices that after an argument, she no longer messages him, yet she never misses a moment of his online presence. He posts something ordinary, and within minutes her name appears among the viewers. No words are exchanged, yet a silent dialogue begins. He feels seen but not met, a connection without contact. Over time, this creates tension, not in her but in him. What is happening psychologically is subtle but powerful. Visibility maintains relevance. Silence maintains control. By staying visible, she anchors herself in your mental landscape. By staying silent, she forces you to make the next move. The power dynamic shifts quietly, almost invisibly. Whoever breaks the silence exposes their need first. There is also something symbolic happening here. In the unconscious, silence paired with visibility mirrors the archetype of the watcher, the one who observes without participating, who withholds while evaluating. It creates the impression of emotional superiority, as though she has already moved on, while you are still processing. Whether or not this is true is irrelevant. What matters is how it feels. And feelings, especially unresolved ones, drive behavior more than logic ever will. This is why her silence feels heavier than anger. Anger can be responded to, argued with, resolved. Silence offers no foothold. It invites projection. You begin to imagine her thoughts, her judgments, her emotional state. In doing so, you hand her space inside your mind, space she does not have to earn. Research on attachment patterns supports this. Studies on avoidant and narcissistic tendencies show that emotional withdrawal combined with intermittent cues of availability creates heightened anxiety and rumination in the other person. The brain releases stress hormones not because of loss, but because of uncertainty. The bond doesn't weaken, it becomes obsessive. And yet, from her perspective, this silence may feel justified. She may tell herself she is protecting her dignity, preserving her self-worth, or teaching you a lesson. But beneath these rationalizations lies a fear of direct vulnerability. Reaching out would mean risking rejection. Staying silent while visible allows her to avoid that risk while still feeding on reassurance. The paradox is this: the more visible she remains, the less detached she truly is. True detachment does not monitor. It does not check. It does not linger in the shadows. When someone has genuinely moved on, they turn their gaze elsewhere. Visibility without engagement reveals unfinished business. This is why her silence feels charged. You sense that something is being held back, not released. And that tension pulls at you, especially if you are emotionally invested or prone to self-reflection. You may feel compelled to restore balance, to resolve the unfinished emotional loop. That impulse to reach out, to ask, to explain is precisely what the silence is designed to evoke. But there is an important psychological truth here. When someone chooses silence over communication, they are choosing control over connection. And when you respond by chasing clarity, you reinforce that choice. Understanding this does not require anger or resentment. It requires awareness. Awareness that silence can be a language, that visibility can be a hook, and that not every absence is an invitation to pursue. Sometimes the most meaningful response to being watched in silence is not to perform, not to explain, not to reach out, but to reclaim your inner stillness. Because the moment you stop reacting to visibility without presence, the dynamic changes. The mirror no longer reflects what she is seeking. And in that quiet shift, power returns, not as dominance but as self-possession. She rewrites the story without ever speaking to you. And this is one of the most psychologically revealing behaviors of all, because it does not happen in conversation but in the unseen theater of meaning. When direct dialogue is avoided, the narrative does not disappear. It simply relocates from the space between two people into the inner world, where interpretation replaces truth. When a narcissistic woman begins to reshape the story silently, she is not seeking understanding. She is seeking position. Words spoken to you would require vulnerability, negotiation, and the risk of being seen as imperfect. But a story told without your presence requires none of that. It allows her to become both narrator and judge, shaping events in a way that preserves her self-image while quietly assigning you a role that justifies her withdrawal. You may notice this through subtle signals rather than direct accusations. Quotes appear about self-respect, emotional exhaustion, or choosing peace. Posts that suggest she has been wronged, misunderstood, or forced to grow because someone else failed her. No names are mentioned, yet the implication is clear. The story is being told in fragments, designed not to invite dialogue, but to generate agreement from an invisible audience. This behavior serves a deep psychological need. The ego cannot tolerate being the source of harm. It must be the hero, or at the very least the survivor. So the narrative is adjusted, not necessarily with conscious deceit, but with emotional selectivity. Moments where she withdrew are reframed as strength. Moments where she avoided responsibility are reframed as boundaries. And moments where you felt confused or abandoned are quietly erased. What makes this particularly powerful is that you are not there to respond. You are not invited into the process of meaning making. And yet, you are deeply affected by it. Because human beings do not suffer most from conflict. They suffer from being misrepresented. You begin to feel an internal pressure to correct the story, to explain your intentions, to defend your character. This urge is not weakness. It is a natural response to having one's identity distorted. But this is precisely the trap. The moment you reach out to set the record straight, you validate the narrative's power over you. Psychologically, this is a form of moral positioning. By appearing calm, reflective, and morally elevated in public or semi-public spaces, she establishes herself as the one who has done the work. Anyone who questions her version of events risks appearing insensitive or unaware. Meanwhile, you are placed in a silent role, the unspoken cause of her pain, growth, or awakening. In real life, this often looks deceptively peaceful. Friends may comment on how strong she seems, how centered, how she has finally learned to choose herself. And while these observations may contain fragments of truth, they are incomplete. What is missing is mutual accountability. What is missing is your voice. There is something archetypal about this behavior. The human psyche has always relied on stories to create coherence. When relationships fracture, the mind rushes to repair the inner image of the self. For someone with narcissistic tendencies, this repair cannot include shame or ambiguity. The story must be clean, clear, favorable. Complexity is too threatening, but stories written in isolation harden quickly. Without dialogue, they lose flexibility. Over time, the rewritten narrative becomes not just a version of events, but an identity. She no longer says, "This is how I feel." She believes, "This is what happened." And once belief replaces inquiry, the door to genuine connection closes. For you, the emotional impact can be disorienting. You may question your memory, doubt, BT, your intentions. Wonder if you were, in fact, the problem. This is not because you lack insight, but because repeated exposure to a one-sided narrative erodes inner certainty, especially if you are someone who reflects deeply and values self-improvement. Studies on social perception show that when individuals encounter indirect negative narratives about themselves, especially from emotionally significant figures, the brain responds with heightened self-scrutiny and stress. The need to restore moral balance becomes urgent, again, not because you are wrong, but because your psyche seeks coherence. And yet, there is an unspoken truth hidden beneath her rewritten story. If she were truly at peace with her version of events, she would not need to broadcast it. Stories meant for healing are often private. Stories meant for validation require witnesses. This is why her silence toward you coexists with a loud inner monologue projected outward. She does not want conversation, she wants confirmation. Confirmation that her interpretation is accepted. Confirmation that she was right to withdraw. Confirmation that you, in your silence, implicitly agree. But silence does not equal guilt, it often equals restraint. The deeper invitation here is not to challenge her story, but to reclaim your own. To recognize that meaning formed without mutual presence is always incomplete. You do not need to correct every false narrative to preserve your integrity. You do not need to be understood by someone who chose not to ask. When you resist the urge to enter a story written without you, something important happens internally. Your sense of self detaches from her interpretation. The power of the narrative weakens, and you begin to realize that the most honest stories are not the ones told the loudest, but the ones that can withstand silence without needing to be defended. In that realization, a quiet strength emerges. Not the strength of being right, but the strength of being whole. She leaves the door half open, and this is perhaps one of the most unsettling psychological gestures a person can make. A door fully closed brings pain, yes, but it also brings certainty. A door fully open invites connection, but a door left slightly ajar creates something far more powerful, tension. It suspends the mind between hope and loss, between movement and paralysis. And the human psyche does not tolerate suspension for long. When a narcissistic woman leaves the door half open, she does not say goodbye clearly. She does not declare finality. She avoids decisive language. Instead, there are phrases like, "I need space, maybe later," or "I just need time." Objects are not returned. Numbers are not blocked. Memories are left accessible. There is no formal ending, only a quiet drift into emotional fog. This is not confusion on her part. It is an arrangement. At a deeper level, this behavior reflects an inner struggle with control and dependency. Closing the door completely would require confronting loss, not just of you, but of the reflection you provided. Opening it fully would require vulnerability and accountability. So she chooses the in-between state, where neither risk must be faced. The half-open door functions as a psychological tether. It allows her to step away while ensuring that you remain emotionally anchored. You are not rejected, but you are not welcomed are. And in this liminal space, your mind begins to work against you. You replay conversations. You search for meaning in small gestures. You hesitate to move forward because something feels unfinished. Unfinished emotional experiences activate a powerful response in the psyche. Studies in cognitive psychology show that incomplete narratives are remembered more vividly than resolved ones. The mind keeps returning to them, seeking closure. This is why you may feel more attached after the distance than you did before it. The bond tightens not through intimacy, but through uncertainty. Real life offers countless examples of this. Someone says they are not ready for a relationship, yet they continue to message late at night. They say they need space, yet they become uneasy when you pull away. They avoid commitment, yet resist replacement. The door remains open just enough for you to see inside, but never enough to enter. This dynamic quietly reverses responsibility. Because the door is not fully closed, you feel compelled to wait, to be patient, to prove your steadiness. You begin adjusting your behavior around the possibility of her return. And without realizing it, your life starts orbiting a decision she refuses to make. Psychologically, this grants her a sense of superiority without direct confrontation. She does not have to demand your attention. The half-open door does that for her. She does not have to ask you to stay. Your hope does it willingly. The absence of clarity becomes the mechanism of control. Yet beneath this posture of ambiguity lies a profound insecurity. A person who is truly certain does not keep exits and entrances blurred. Certainty requires self-true. Sane ambiguity often signals fear. Fear of being alone, fear of being wrong, fear of losing access to validation, the half-open door also allows her to return without humility. If she comes back, she was never really gone. If she doesn't, she can claim you misinterpreted the situation. The responsibility is subtly shifted away from her and placed onto your perception. This protects the ego while eroding your confidence in your own judgment. Emotionally, this can be exhausting. You may feel as though you are standing in a hallway, neither inside nor outside, waiting for a sign. Time passes, but nothing resolves. And over time, this waiting begins to feel like loyalty, even though it was never requested explicitly. There is something deeply symbolic about this image. A door represents transition, choice, and agency. To leave it half open is to deny transition while preserving control over choice. It keeps you psychologically available without granting you emotional access. But here is the quiet truth that often goes unnoticed. A door left half open is not an invitation, it is a test. A test of how long you will remain suspended. A test of how much uncertainty you will tolerate in exchange for the possibility of connection. When someone truly values you, they do not leave you standing in thresholds. They either invite you in or let you go. The space in between is not care. It is hesitation shaped by self-interest. Understanding this is not about blame. It is about clarity. Because once you recognize the function of the half-open door, its power begins to fade. You see that what felt like hope was actually delay. What felt like patience was actually self-abandonment. And when that realization settles in, something shifts internally. You stop waiting for movement from the other side. You reclaim your right to decide whether you will remain in the hallway or walk away entirely. The door may still be open, but you are no longer standing in front of it, asking silently to be chosen. She tests your replacement value, and this behavior reveals far more than any words ever could. It is not about attraction, and it is not even about moving on. It is about measurement. When a narcissistic woman begins to test whether you can be replaced, she is not asking who will take your place in her life. She is asking whether you still recognize your place in hers. This testing often begins subtly. A sudden increase in social visibility. New photos that feel carefully staged rather than spontaneous. Casual mentions of people who show interest in her. Laughter that seems just a little louder when you are within reach of noticing. None of this is random. It is an unconscious experiment designed to provoke an inner reaction in you, because your reaction is the data she is collecting. At a psychological level, this behavior is rooted in comparison. The narcissistic psyche relies on reflection to maintain its sense of worth. It needs to see itself as desirable, chosen, and irreplaceable. When the bond with you becomes uncertain, she does not turn inward to examine her feelings. Instead, she looks outward to measure her value through others, and through you. You may notice that this testing intensifies when you begin to pull back, when you stop chasing, or when you appear emotionally steady without her. Suddenly, her world seems full of attention. Compliments surf. Ace. Invitations appear. She seems wanted. But this display is not meant for those new faces. It is meant for the one whose gaze matters most in that moment. Yours. In real life, this often feels confusing. You might think, if she has so many options, why does she care if I see this? The answer lies in the difference between having attention and feeling valued. Attention can be abundant. Validation is specific. She wants to know whether she still occupies a unique position in her inner world. This is where the emotional manipulation becomes subtle but powerful. By suggesting that you are replaceable, she attempts to invert the power dynamic. If you believe you can be replaced easily, you are more likely to compete, to re-engage, to prove your worth. The fear of being forgotten awakens an old human instinct. The fear of abandonment. Psychological studies on social comparison show that perceived replacement activates deep insecurity, even in confident individuals. The brain interprets it as a threat to identity, not just to relationship. This is why the reaction feels disproportionate. It's not jealousy, it's existential anxiety. But here is the paradox: the more someone works to show they can replace you, the more it reveals that they are unsure whether they should. Genuine replacement does not announce itself. When someone has emotionally moved on, they do not look back to see who is watching. This testing behavior often includes contradictions. She may say she wants independence, yet becomes disturbed when you stop reacting. She may claim she's exploring new connections, yet monitors your responses closely. She may appear confident in public, yet seek reassurance in private ways. These inconsistencies are not accidents. They are signs of an unresolved attachment struggling to maintain dominance without intimacy. At a deeper level, this reflects a fragile inner structure. A stable sense of self does not require constant comparison. It does not need to prove desirability by diminishing someone else's value. But when self-worth is externally regulated, replacement becomes a tool, both a threat and a reassurance. For you, the emotional impact can be significant. You may feel suddenly inadequate. You may begin questioning what you lacked, what others offer, why you weren't enough. This self-questioning is precisely what keeps you psychologically engaged. Your attention shifts from understanding the dynamic to evaluating yourself. And in that shift, you lose ground. There is something almost ritualistic about this process. She displays options, she waits, she watches for your response. Does your energy change? Do you reach out? Do you compete? Do you retreat? Each reaction provides feedback, not about love, but about control. But the deepest truth remains hidden beneath the surface. Replacement testing is not a sign of abundance, it is a sign of insecurity. It is born from the fear that without your attention, her sense of value might collapse. That fear cannot be soothed by others because it was never about them. It was about the mirror you once provided. Understanding this does not require confrontation, it requires detachment from the game itself. The moment you stop measuring yourself against imagined rivals, the test loses meaning. The moment you stop reacting, the experiment fails, because your value was never determined by how easily someone else could take your place. And anyone who needs to test that value does not hold the authority to define it. When you remain grounded, when you do not compete for attention that was once freely given, something subtle shifts. The power of replacement dissolves. And what remains is a quiet recognition. The one being tested was never you. It was her certainty. She reacts emotionally when you don't reach out, and this reaction speaks louder than any confession ever could. Indifference is calm, closure is quiet, but emotional reaction, especially when no contact exists, reveals attachment that has not dissolved. When someone claims distance yet becomes unsettled by your silence, the contradiction exposes what still lives beneath the surface. At first, the reaction may be subtle, a sudden shift in tone online, posts that feel sharper, heavier, or strangely performative, a quote about being misunderstood, a message meant for no one and everyone at once. These expressions are not random moods, they are responses to a perceived absence that feels threatening. Your silence becomes a mirror she cannot control, and what she sees in it unsettles her. Psychologically, this happens because attention once flowed in a familiar rhythm. When that rhythm stops, the inner balance is disturbed. For a narcissistic woman, validation is not optional, it is structural. It stabilizes her sense of self. When you don't reach out, that structure weakens. The emotional reaction is not about missing you in a romantic sense. It is about losing a reflection that confirmed her importance. This is why your silence feels louder to her than any argument ever did. Conflict at least confirms engagement. Silence removes certainty. It forces the mind to confront a question that has no easy answer. Do I still matter to them? For someone whose identity leans heavily on external affirmation, this question produces anxiety. In everyday life, this reaction often appears paradoxical. She may act cold or dismissive toward you, yet show agitation when you do not pursue her. She may accuse you of being distant, even though she created the distance. She may suddenly reach out indirectly, through mutual friends, social media gestures, or cryptic messages that stop just short of vulnerability. Each act is an emotional probe, testing whether the connection still exists. What is important to understand is that these reactions are not signs of strength. They are signs of inner instability. Emotional equilibrium does not require constant feedback. When someone has genuinely let go, the absence of contact registers as neutral, not provocative. Reaction indicates unresolved dependence. There is a deeper psychological mechanism at work here. When a familiar source of validation disappears, the psyche experiences something akin to withdrawal. Studies on attachment and reward pathways show that sudden loss of emotional reinforcement activates stress responses similar to physical deprivation. The mind searches for ways to restore balance, often through emotional expression or indirect contact. This is why her reactions may escalate over time. If silence persists, the emotional display may intensify. Posts become more dramatic, messages more ambiguous. The need to be seen grows louder. Not because you are cruel, but because your absence has disrupted an internal system she relied upon. For you, witnessing this can be confusing. You may feel pulled back into engagement out of empathy, guilt, or curiosity. You may wonder whether her reaction means she still cares deeply, and perhaps she does. But care alone does not equal health. Emotional reactivity without direct communication often signals a desire for reassurance without responsibility. There is something deeply human about this. No one enjoys feeling forgotten. But there is a difference between missing someone and needing them to regulate your sense of worth. When emotional reactions arise solely because attention is withdrawn, they reveal a dependence that was never mutual. This dynamic often reverses roles. She becomes the one reacting while you remain still, and this reversal can feel uncomfortable, especially if you were once the pursuer. You may feel tempted to re-enter the dynamic simply to restore emotional balance, but doing so often resets the pattern rather than resolving it. The unspoken truth is this: emotional reactions to your silence are not invitations for reconciliation. They are attempts to regain equilibrium. She does not reach out directly because that would expose vulnerability. Instead, she expresses emotion in ways that place the responsibility of response back onto you. Understanding this allows you to see her reactions with clarity rather than guilt. You are not causing harm by choosing not to engage. You are simply no longer participating in a dynamic that required your constant presence to function. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not cruelty. It is boundary, and boundaries often provoke emotional reactions in those who benefited from their absence. The most powerful shift occurs when you stop interpreting her emotional responses as signals you must answer, when you recognize them as reflections of her inner struggle rather than judgments of your character. In that recognition, your silence becomes stable, not reactive, grounded, not defensive. And in that stillness, something profound happens. The emotional storm passes through her without pulling you back into its center. You no longer chase resolution where none is offered. You no longer confuse reaction with connection. What remains is clarity, not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of self-possession. And from that place, your silence is no longer a response to her. It is an expression of your own emotional sovereignty. Here is the deeper truth. When someone waits for you to reach out, instead of reaching out themselves, they are asking you to abandon your boundaries to restore their comfort. And real power, real self-worth, does not chase silence. It does not beg for clarity. It does not negotiate for respect. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not respond to the invitation, because not every door left open leads somewhere worth returning to.